The right to vote is one of the most universally believed and accepted rights throughout this country. It is a belief that is universally shared amongst almost all Americans throughout this country, and it's one of the core values of our democracy. And while it is mostly shared by all Americans, it is the unfortunate truth that many Americans do not have easy, unburdened access to this fundamental right. Voter suppression, discriminatory voting laws, and disenfranchisement of specific groups, often minorities, have always been and continues today to be an extremely pervasive issue throughout the United States. First, I want to talk a little bit about the history of voter suppression and disenfranchisement in this country. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with how it used to be that only rich white landowning men over the age of 21 were able to vote. That's how it was in America for a long time, even before America was founded. Before America was founded, you had states like my home state of Massachusetts. In their constitution, still to this day, it says, as it doesn't apply anymore, but still says the text of only rich white men over the age of 21 can vote. And that was very universal throughout America up until the Civil War. It was continuously like that. Around the time of the Civil War, continuing up to the present, you started to see the emergence of various different voting rights amendments. And there's four I'm going to briefly mention. Which was the 15th Amendment, and that came about right after the Civil War, and that gave the right to vote regardless of the basis of race. The 19th Amendment in the 1910s, which granted women the right to vote. The 24th Amendment, which banned poll taxes after poll taxes and Jim Crow laws in the South became a huge issue, which I will very much talk about later. And the 26th Amendment, which was recently ratified in the past few decades, which allowed the voting age to be lowered to 18. So it really should be clear that voter suppression was an obvious trait of America in the past, but I would like to explain in my lecture today how it continues in the future and today. So the first major way that people are disenfranchised in this country legally is through felon disenfranchisement laws. So essentially, I believe it's about 13 or so states in the union that have laws that say once you are convicted of a felony for the rest of your life, you may never vote again. Various states have different degrees. So Maine and Vermont actually are the opposite. They allow prison felons to vote in jail. And there are different degrees of, once you get on parole, you can vote. Once you're done with your sentence, you can vote, various different degrees throughout the union. But there are a good amount of states that, there's a good amount of states where you are convicted of a felony, you can no longer vote. And in most other states, in 48 states, you are disenfranchised to some extent. So now you might be thinking, oh, well, we don't want dangerous people to vote. And that seems like a good idea at first until you actually look at the effects and what has come about because of felon disenfranchisement. So Black people, I'm gonna assert this right now as a fact, and I will back it up later, but I'm gonna assert this as a fact right now. Black people and other minorities are arrested and convicted of crimes at disproportionately higher rates. To back this up, I'm first gonna introduce an article by Carlos Baradeo, entitled Plea Bargaining, Racial Disparities and Discrimination from the Boston College Law Review. He is a professor at Loyola Law School, just for context. And in his article, he mentioned, he talks a bit about the criminal justice system and how felon disenfranchisement has played a role in that. And he first mentions how the first point I'm going to bring up from him is how he found that the incarceration rate for Black defendants was way higher than the incarceration rate for white defendants. So this is not just who's accused of a crime and who's arrested. This is of who is sent to jail. It's 52% for Black defendants compared to only 35% for white defendants. That is the first piece of information I'm going to be asserting today of completely disproportionate rates. He also found that through analyzing FBI data, Black people were arrested at 5 times the rate in the 800 jurisdictions that he analyzed. And that felon disenfranchisement blocked in the 2014-2016 election period, blocked 1 in 13 African Americans nationwide from voting. That 1 in every 13 African Americans were legally barred from voting in this country in the present. So that's one that should be shocking. That should shock you to hear. It was also found that this disproportionate rates, excuse me, it was also found that these rates were not linked to crime. So in another article I'm going to introduce by Anthony Jamal Phillips and Natalie Deckard, entitled Felon Disenfranchisement Laws and the Feedback Loop of the Political Exclusion, specifically the case of Florida. It was an article in the Journal of African American Studies, published in 2016. And in this article, the authors look at they explicitly look at felon disenfranchisement laws, and as the title implies, the feedback loop of political exclusion, which is what I'm trying to get at here. So the reason they talk about Florida is one of the states in the union that once you are convicted of a felony, you are for life disenfranchised. I think there are pushes to change that, but I believe as of now, and as of the time of writing that article, that is the case. They write, felon disenfranchisement laws may be most arduous in those states with the most political interest in neutralizing the potential threat of African-American voters, rather than those with the most crime. So they're finding, in their article, they're finding that these disenfranchisement laws are not correlated and linked to higher crime, but they are actually correlated and linked to disenfranchising minorities and Black people. So that should be proof right there that these laws, while they seem good intentioned, have actually extremely racist and racial undertones, and how they can have extreme effects on disenfranchisement. Another changing gears, this is another major way that voter suppression continues today, and it's through voter ID laws. So the thing with voter ID laws is they actually seem like a really good idea at first, because you think of elections and you think they have to be really secure and you don't want voter fraud. And of course, we don't want voter fraud. But once you actually start to think about what voter ID laws mean, very much like disenfranchisement laws, you start to see the extremely negative consequences. And also like felon disenfranchisement laws, you see how minorities and Black people are disproportionately affected from voting. And I will explain why. So I'm also going to introduce another article. It's by Lydia Hardy, entitled The Voter Suppression Post-Shelby Impacts and Issues of Voter Purge and Voter ID Laws. And this was an article from the Mercer Law Review, which is a law journal completely written by the students of Mercer University School of Law. It's the oldest continuously published law review in Georgia, according to their website. So in her article, Lydia Hardy writes, restrictive voter ID laws tend to be introduced in states with a larger share of African-American persons, non-citizens persons, and higher minority voter turnout, as well as in states where both minority and low income turnout recently increased. So that is, I'm trying to, again, link this to what we were saying with felon disenfranchisement, how these laws are not related to what they're trying to do. Felon disenfranchisement is not to keep dangerous people from voting, and voter ID laws is not to protect against fraud. They are both to disenfranchisement. They are both to disenfranchise, excuse me. They are both made to disenfranchise people that the politicians do not want voting. The voter ID data shows that people in states, this is also from the Hardy article, voter data shows that people in states with strict photo ID laws were twice as likely not to vote due to lack of identification, with Black and Latino voters more likely not to possess the requisite ID than others, in addition to the lack of income to pay for IDs or access to transportation to obtain those IDs or the documentation to get those IDs, as well as various other socioeconomic factors. So in 2015, also from the Hardy article, 25% of Black people and 16% of Latino people lacked government-issued identification. That's 1 in 4 Black people, and I'm not sure what 16% is, but 16% of Latino people, 16 out of 100, lacked the proper government-issued identification, compared to, this is the key part, compared to only 8% of white people. So now we get to how the voter ID laws affect minority and Black populations much more than they do white people, because of the pervasive racism and systemic racism in this country. Black people and minorities are at significant disadvantages and are often in lower socioeconomic classes than white people because of the disadvantages inherent in our society, and that results in them being furtherly disadvantaged through they are poorer, and so because they are poorer, they might not have access to transportation to get the voter ID. They might not have the money to get the voter ID. They might not have the proper documentation on hand to get the voter ID. They might not have time to get the voter ID because they're too busy working a 10-hour long shift minimum wage job to feed their 3-person family, and they're a single parent. And And this should really show how most people think voter ID is a good idea, because the people who think that are those who have easy access to voter ID. So they assume, oh, well, everyone has the easy access. And if you are still thinking that voter ID is easy, voter ID requirements are easy to satisfy, I want you to do something for me. If you're still not convinced, I want you to do something for me. I want you to right now think of the obstacles, think of what you had to do to register to vote in your state. I want you to actually think about it right now. And now what I want you to do is I want you to think of how much more challenging it would have been if you were in a far lower socioeconomic class. So maybe you had to submit a driver's license. Well, maybe you're poorer and you don't have a car, or maybe you're poorer so you don't have a way to get to the DMV or the RMV. You don't have money to pay the fee to get the driver's license, to get a government issued ID. You don't have time to go there. Maybe you don't actually have enough of the proper documentation on hand. There's various reasons, but I want you to think of how your privilege may have given you a much easier time at registering to vote. So those are the two main arguments I'm making: felon disenfranchisement and voter ID laws, and how they disproportionately affect minorities and Black people. There is another quick argument I want to make about voters in DC and Puerto Rico. They are fully fledged United States citizens. Residents of DC, Puerto Rico, and every single American territory except for American Samoa, they are American citizens. And all of those groups also, they are also fully taxed by the federal government, and they pay income taxes. But they are unable to vote in any election, with the exception DC is able to vote in presidential elections, 23rd Amendment. But other than that, they get no representation in Congress, and they still have to pay taxes. And this is exactly against the phrase "no taxation without representation," which was one of the phrases that sparked the Revolutionary War. And these are territories. We might as well call them colonies. That's what they are. They're the American colonies. It's part of the American empire. And we're just calling them territories as a nicer word. We are literally taxing our colonies and not giving them representation. That sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? It seems pretty hypocritical of the United States to do. So to wrap up, I know it's really hard to believe that all of this voter suppression still occurs in America today. It is very shocking. I agree. And this kind of systemic racism, this kind of systematic racist voter suppression seems like it's a thing of the past and that it should be illegal today. But it's very much legal today. In fact, the courts have upheld in cases like Shelby County v. Holder, Crawford v. Marion County Election Board, that these laws, these voter ID laws, can be upheld. And there are even more methods of suppressing and manipulating votes that I didn't even get to mention, such as racial gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, the Electoral College, voter roll purges, and other various statewide voter laws. At this point, it really should be abundantly clear that America's racist and discriminatory past of voting rights did not end when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And through a broken racist justice system, which disproportionately disenfranchises Black Americans and minorities, and through racially biased voter ID laws, it is still very much an issue that continues to this day. And thank you for watching.